If you buy a Mac with too little RAM, you're gonna regret it really fast. And if you buy one with too much RAM, you're just gonna waste your money. So how much RAM do you really need? 8 gigs, 18 gigs, or 128 gigs? In this video, I'm gonna break it all down and help you make the right choice. There are two things you need to know before choosing the size of your new Mac. What is this RAM and what is this swap? RAM stands for Random Access Memory, and it's basically the short-term memory of your Mac. On Apple Silicon Macs, RAM is actually part of a unified memory system, which combines both your typical RAM and GPU memory into a single high-speed module. When you are browsing the web, all the websites you open get stored in unified memory for quick access, and when you switch tabs, the computer just fetches the data from memory. When you are, for example, editing a video or writing a document, your Mac stores there all the information the app needs to run properly. The more unified memory you have, the more data your computer can store without the need to reload things or use swap. This swap is like a get out of jail free card for your Mac. When the RAM fills up to the brim, your computer doesn't just close the open apps. Instead, it starts using the SSD of your Mac as RAM. Upload in there the data that still needs to be easily accessible but doesn't require super fast access. Now, you might be asking, why should I even care about it then if the Mac can figure everything out by itself? Well, the RAM on modern Apple Silicon MacBooks works differently from your typical RAM in a Windows computer. And the best way to see the importance of RAM is by looking at the lowest amount of it that Apple offers, 8 gigabytes. 8 gigs is kind of a meme because Apple puts it in so many different Macs that it stops making sense anymore to an average person. MacBook Airs start with only 8 gigs of unified memory. Mac Mini and iMac also start with 8 gigs. And then the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 starts with 8 gigabytes. Does it mean it's a good choice to go for 8 gigs? Well, if you plan on browsing the web and type in simple documents, then sure, go for it. 8 gigs will be enough for simple tasks that you do every day, even for occasional heavy workloads such as editing a bunch of photos or 4K video. But such heavy workloads must be occasional and not permanent, because that's where the nature of MacBook's memory starts playing a crucial role. As I mentioned earlier, with the transition to Apple Silicon, Apple introduced us to unified memory, which means the memory is used both for your typical RAM and as a memory for the GPU. So if you have an 8 gigabyte machine, you only get around 6 usable gigs of memory. Then the macOS itself eats 2 or 3 more gigabytes, leaving you with only 3 to 4 gigs of RAM you can actually use. That's where the swap comes in. The Mac starts using it like crazy. In case you're not familiar with how the SSDs work, they don't like it when you read and write data on them in quick succession. Swap is like a silent and slow killer of your SSD. In 1 year, you won't see that much of an SSD degradation, but after having the same MacBook for 3 or 4 years, you will start experiencing slowdowns and constant beach balls. If you do want your MacBook to last longer and be more future-proof, then you absolutely have to get 16 or 18 gigs of memory. 16 gigs is a $200 upgrade, and I'm not really advocating for it, at least from a financial standpoint. The reason is simple. It makes your Mac simply too expensive to justify it. Because if you're paying $200 for 16 gigs of RAM, and then the 256 gig SSD becomes your bottleneck, then you have to pay $200 more to upgrade that to 512 gigs, so your $1,000 MacBook Air suddenly starts costing $1,400, and your $1,600 M3 MacBook Pro jumps all the way to $2,000, which is equivalent to the proper 14-inch MacBook Pro with M3 Pro inside, 18 gigs of unified memory, and 512 gigs of SSD. So here's what I'm offering. If you're not planning on storing a bunch of files on your MacBook Air, but you know for sure that your workflow will need more than 8 gigs of RAM, pay those $200 and get the 16 gigs. Forget about the SSD upgrade then. This way your Mac will be able to store even more data in RAM, perform better in heavy apps, and even play games with higher frame rate. I mean, sure, this will not turn your MacBook Air into MacBook Pro, but it will be a really worthy upgrade for future-proofing it. As I already mentioned, 18 gigs of RAM is the standard config for the M3 Pro MacBook Pro, and there isn't that much difference between 16 and 18 gigs of memory in terms of performance. This amount of unified memory is probably the best size you can get without robbing yourself. It's more than enough for day-to-day tasks and even for heavy-duty workloads such as editing videos, programming, or doing complex 3D modeling. 16 or 18 gigs will not limit your growth for at least a couple of years and will be enough for practically anything you can throw at your Mac. The most questionable memory size I can think of is the 24 gig option on MacBook Airs, Pro, iMac, and Mac Mini. It's a $400 upgrade over the standard 8 gigs, and to me this sounds absolutely ridiculous. If you're buying the MacBook Air, there is absolutely no point in spending that much money on memory. Just go with 16 gigs. It will be more than enough for you. Sure, technically 24 gigs is better than 16, but in most apps, the difference will be negligible. Do you really want to pay $200 extra just to shave off a couple of seconds here and there? I don't think so. Don't waste your money on 24 gigs. It's not worth it. If you are really serious and your workflow needs you to compile huge projects, or you render 4K videos on a daily basis, you export thousands of heavy photos at once, you might want to think about 32 or 36 gigabytes of unified memory. That much memory will practically make you invincible. No matter what you do, you will have enough RAM for it. Whether you just hate closing tabs in browsers, or you are a hardcore photographer who needs to stitch huge panoramas or do a complex HDR merge, you will have RAM for that. With 32 or 36 gigs of memory, you can comfortably do complex 3D work, physics simulations, fluid simulations, or just play games. Should you pay for this upgrade? Well, only if you know for sure that you need that. This is a $400 upgrade, and it can make your MacBook really expensive. For example, 14-inch MacBook Pro with 36 gigs of unified memory will cost you $2,400, and at this point it starts making sense to also pay a bit extra and get a better version of the M3 Pro, which costs another $200. So for $2,600 in total, you can get yourself an ultimate laptop that will last you for many years to come and do everything. 36 gigs is probably the last memory config that's easy to talk about, because the next step in this Mac evolution is 48 gigs. And you can get it only if you buy the MacBook with an unbinned M3 Max for $3,500. In this case, 48 gigs will be a default config, and believe me, you don't need that much. 48 gigs is also more than 36 gigs, but only the real professionals will see the difference. If you are a regular person who just wants a Mac that will last you for many years, 48 gigs is somewhat of an overkill. Obviously, I don't need to mention that all apps and games in 48 gigs will work like a charm without a single slowdown or stutter. I think people who are buying the Max chips already know what they need all this horsepower for. From my point of view, I can imagine you do a lot of video editing on a professional level, motion graphics, compose music with hundreds of audio tracks, and even create games. So the only question you might be having at this point is whether you should go for 64 gigs. Honestly, I find it a bit hard to answer this simply because it's still a bit difficult for me to imagine a workflow where 48 gigs will be a bottleneck for you. But hey, if you already know that, let's say 32 gigs isn't enough for you, then maybe you should go for the 64. And it's only a $200 upgrade, which seems like nothing when you add that to a MacBook that already costs over $3,500. And if you're someone who needs even more memory than 64 gigs, then there are two options for you: 96 or 128 gigabytes. You can get 96 only if you buy a MacBook with a binned M3 Max that has a 14-core CPU and a 30-core GPU. 128 gig option is only available with the highest end M3 Max, and I think that everything Apple has done with these two configs is somewhat strange. If you want to buy one Mac and use it for many years in only heavy-duty applications, I think the power of the M3 Max will run out faster than you feel that you're lacking RAM. I'm serious, 128 gigs and even 96 gigs is so much memory that there are only a handful of apps can properly utilize all that amount. I think it will be enough to start browsing in January and finish in December without closing a single tab and still have all of the tabs open. If you need that much RAM, please leave a comment and tell me why. I think it's clear that a regular person shouldn't go over 36 or, in very rare cases, 48 gigs of unified memory. That's the natural limit that at least makes sense to me. If you're planning on buying the MacBook Air that comes originally with 8 gigabytes, it makes sense to upgrade to 16 gigs, but only if you're not planning on buying additional storage. Because in that case, you might want to look for a refurbished MacBook Pro that will come standard with a bigger SSD and more memory. And also, let's not forget that all these upgrades that you do are final. You cannot buy any additional RAM RAM after you order your MacBook. I mean, sure, there are a couple of repair stores in your country that can solder more memory and make it all work, but usually this costs more than just upgrading the RAM on Apple's website while placing an order. So yeah, if you are the most basic user and plan on getting a MacBook for simple tasks, 8 gigs will be fine for at least a few years, though I would still recommend getting 16 just to be sure. 16 or 18 gigs are the best RAM sizes for regular people, enough for complex work and will last a long time. 32 and 36 gigs will be great for people who are hovering above a demanding user and near the super advanced user category of people. 48 and 64 gigs, get them only if you know for sure that you need them. Get them if your workflow is way too complex for a 32 gig Mac to handle. And if you are superhuman with impossible needs, only then should you go for 96 or 128 gigs. And now you know exactly how much RAM you need, and I hope you also learned something new along the way. And if you are seriously considering buying a new MacBook, we have a great video about M series chips where I go over each one and discuss who should buy it and why. So be sure to check it out. Thanks for watching. See you there.